What if the world you thought you knew was built on secrets so horrific no one dared to speak them aloud? Imagine a quiet North Carolina night in 1835, the air thick with the smoke of burning fields, the screams of men who once held power, now silenced forever. 17 masters dead. 1 month of terror that no history book wanted you to read. What drove men and women, enslaved and oppressed, to orchestrate one of the bloodiest revolts in the country's history? And why were the details buried so deep that nearly everyone forgot they ever happened? Tonight, we pull back the veil. The story you're about to hear was meant to be hidden, but the truth has a way of clawing its way into the light. The year was 1835, and North Carolina's landscape was a tapestry of wealth and oppression, its lush fields of cotton and tobacco stretching like a silent promise of prosperity for those who owned them. The estates were enormous, their whitewashed walls gleaming under the sun, reflecting a power that seemed untouchable. Yet beneath this serene facade, a grim reality festered, hidden from the public eye, and even from most historians who would later write sanitized versions of the past. For generations, the enslaved had been forced into lives of relentless labor, their bodies broken by the lash, their spirits tempered by fear and the unyielding presence of white overseers. But within this oppression, a quiet, simmering resistance began to take root. The seeds of revolt were sown not in a single moment, but over decades of suffering, deprivation, and the steady accumulation of anger that no whip, no punishment, no threat could fully erase. Every day, enslaved men and women endured not just the physical labor of the fields, but the psychological torment of a system designed to strip them of autonomy and hope. Families were torn apart at auction blocks, mothers separated from children, brothers and sisters sold to distant plantations. Education, literacy, and the ability to communicate freely were forbidden, and yet knowledge found its way into hidden corners, a word whispered at night, a clandestine lesson in reading or arithmetic, a story passed from one generation to the next about survival, cunning, and endurance. It was within this atmosphere of quiet defiance that the revolt began to take shape. Those who would rise against their oppressors were not naive or impulsive. They were calculating, aware of the risks, and painfully cognizant of the consequences. They had observed the routines of their masters for years, the timing of meals, the shifts of guards, the patterns of travel between plantations. They noted when the patrols were lax, when the overseers became complacent, and when opportunities might emerge to strike decisively. Every small act of subversion, stolen food, broken tools, feigned illness, was a rehearsal for something far larger. Each act was a reminder that even in bondage, control was never absolute. The revolt also found its roots in the broader currents of fear and resistance circulating across the southern United States at the time. Tales of uprisings in other states, whispers of plots and conspiracies, and the looming specter of freedom offered by the abolitionist movement in the North all seeped into the consciousness of the enslaved. Even when direct communication was impossible, news traveled along informal networks, through traders, passing workers, and clandestine letters. The enslaved people were not isolated. They were part of a living, breathing web of knowledge and rumor that informed their understanding of the world and their possibilities within it. Economic pressures also played a subtle, yet significant role in creating the conditions for revolt. In North Carolina, the reliance on slave labor to sustain the prosperity of plantations was immense. The crops could not be harvested, the profits could not be realized, without the labor of the enslaved. This dependency, however, was a double-edged sword. The more the region prospered from forced labor, the more vulnerable the plantation owners became to coordinated resistance. Every whip strike, every punishment intended to assert dominance, created ripples of resentment and hatred that spread beneath the surface like an unseen current. The masters had wealth and guns, the enslaved had numbers, ingenuity, and, most importantly, the will to survive and reclaim a fraction of the freedom they were denied. Religious and cultural elements also shaped the psyche of those plotting the revolt. Spirituality provided a source of strength, resilience, and moral grounding. Hidden gatherings in the woods, often referred to as hush harbors, allowed the enslaved to express themselves freely through song, prayer, and storytelling. In these spaces, they cultivated a shared understanding of justice, retribution, and liberation. The hymns sung in these gatherings carried messages of hope and coded instruction, and the rhythms of drums and footwork became subtle methods of communication. Every song, every prayer, every story was a thread in the tapestry of rebellion, quietly preparing those who would rise to act when the moment came. It is impossible to discuss the origins of this revolt without acknowledging the brutality of the system itself. Violence was a constant presence. A simple mistake in the field, a perceived act of defiance, could lead to severe corporal punishment or death. This omnipresent threat created a psychological environment of both fear and cunning. The enslaved learned to observe, to anticipate, and to conceal their intentions. They had to operate in plain sight, maintaining the illusion of submission while their minds churned with strategies for escape, sabotage, and, ultimately, vengeance. The contrast between the outward compliance and the inward fury was a defining characteristic of the uprising. The revolt did not emerge from a single leader or a single plantation. It was the cumulative result of years of shared suffering and silent communication, a collective intelligence born of oppression. The conspirators came from different plantations, different owners, and different backgrounds, but they were united by a singular goal: to reclaim power, even if only briefly, and to challenge the system that had defined every aspect of their existence. Their collaboration required secrecy, discipline, and courage. Every whispered plan, every clandestine meeting, carried the risk of discovery and execution, yet the inevitability of their actions seemed woven into the very fabric of the plantations themselves. By the spring of 1835, the conditions were ripe for action. The anger that had simmered for decades, the knowledge that had been secretly accumulated, and the audacity born of necessity converged into a singular, explosive intent. Those who had been considered property by law were about to claim agency in the most violent, unmistakable manner possible. They would orchestrate what would become one of the bloodiest revolts in American history, a month-long campaign of retribution that would claim 17 lives among the ruling class. But before the first attack could be carried out, the careful planning, the observation of patterns, and the shared understanding of vulnerability were the true instruments of their revolt. Every detail mattered. Which doors to unlock, which guards to avoid, which signals to follow. This was a revolt born not out of impulse, but out of inevitability. It was the natural consequence of a system so cruel that those it sought to dominate ultimately decided to seize control through fire, blood, and strategy. The uprising of 1835 in North Carolina was not an isolated eruption of anger. It was the culmination of years of silent planning, whispered resistance, and a collective determination to be heard, even if only through violence. It was a dark testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, to resist, and to strike back when the world has been stacked entirely against you. The organization of the revolt was not born from chaos or desperation alone. It was an intricate web of strategy, secrecy, and unspoken trust forged under the most oppressive conditions imaginable. Those enslaved on the plantations of North Carolina in 1835 were well aware that a single mistake could mean death, yet they found ways to communicate, plan, and coordinate with astonishing precision. Their methods were subtle, hidden in plain sight, and often invisible to the masters who believed they controlled every aspect of their lives. Meetings were whispered about in the shadows, often in the dead of night when the overseers slept and the plantations were quiet. These gatherings were never formal, but they were essential. They took place in barns, under trees, or in small hidden clearings where the sounds of the night, crickets, wind, distant farm animals, could mask the faintest whisper. Every word had to be measured, every signal carefully crafted, because betrayal or discovery meant not only death for the conspirators but also the extinguishing of the revolt before it began. In these clandestine meetings, maps of the plantations were memorized, patrol routes noted, and escape paths rehearsed mentally. Communication across different plantations was even more daring. Traders, field hands, and domestic servants became messengers, carrying coded phrases and subtle signals from one plantation to the next. A particular knock on a door, a unique arrangement of laundry lines, or the timing of a song could convey critical instructions without arousing suspicion. The enslaved had learned to harness the mundane, the ordinary rhythms of plantation life, as tools of secret coordination. Every chore, every interaction with the masters, became a calculated opportunity to pass information. In this way, the network of the revolt extended far beyond a single property. It spanned across multiple estates, connecting those who were physically distant through a shared understanding and purpose. Leadership was not centralized in the way modern revolutions are often imagined. There was no single commander issuing orders from a visible perch. Instead, authority was fluid, shared among those who had the knowledge, the skill, and the respect of their peers. Some were expert at observation, others at persuasion, and others at devising traps or understanding the weaknesses of their oppressors. They communicated in hushed tones about who should lead the first strike, how to time attacks, and where to concentrate efforts for maximum impact. The balance of power within this underground network was delicate. Trust had to be earned, and loyalty was enforced not with guns but with shared survival and the unspoken understanding that betrayal would be met with swift, often fatal consequences. Training was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet effective. Field hands learned to move silently through the tall cotton stalks, mimicking the natural sounds of the wind and wildlife to conceal their movements. Domestic servants, who had intimate knowledge of their master's routines, rehearsed scenarios in their minds: when to strike, how to incapacitate overseers, and which routes offered the safest exits. Some enslaved even smuggled small tools, hidden weapons, and makeshift instruments, gradually assembling the arsenal needed to carry out attacks that were both precise and deadly. Every task, from fetching water to carrying firewood, was an opportunity to prepare without arousing suspicion. The revolt also relied on psychological warfare. The conspirators understood the power of fear, both in themselves and in their targets. Stories of past uprisings and revolts in other states were circulated quietly to instill courage, but also to create the illusion of inevitability, the idea that the oppressed could and would rise. Simultaneously, the masters remained unaware of the growing storm. To them, the enslaved appeared compliant, dutiful, even timid. But beneath this facade, meticulous planning was underway. Every master had blind spots, and every plantation had routines that could be exploited. The conspirators studied these patterns relentlessly, knowing that success depended on exploiting the smallest gaps in vigilance. Timing was critical. The Atelier organizers understood that the revolt could not be spontaneous. It required coordination, patience, and the selection of a moment when the masters were most vulnerable. Seasonal labor, religious observances, and local events all played a role in choosing the precise moment to act. Certain nights, when moonlight was dim and guards were few, offered perfect cover. Others, when the plantation owners were preoccupied with travel or social gatherings, provided opportunities to strike with devastating effectiveness. The conspirators' knowledge of the calendar, the weather, and the rhythms of plantation life became as important as their physical preparedness. Perhaps most astonishing was the level of discipline and secrecy maintained across such a vast network. Enslaved individuals risked not only their lives, but the lives of friends and family, yet they remained resolute. They devised contingency plans for failure, fallback points for regrouping, and signals to indicate success or danger. No message was left to chance, no action unexamined. Even when betrayal was suspected, the network adapted, recalibrating its strategies to ensure that the revolt could proceed. This was not the impulsive violence of desperation. It was the careful, calculated orchestration of people who understood both the stakes and the methods required to achieve them. The organization also depended on the integration of disparate skills. Some conspirators were skilled with fire, others with stealth, some with intimidation, and still others with knowledge of the natural environment. Fields and forests were mapped mentally, rivers, creeks, and hidden trails were memorized as escape routes or avenues of attack. Even animals were enlisted in the plan. Dogs were diverted or distracted, horses stolen for rapid transport. Every element of the environment became a tool or obstacle in a strategy that was as much about cunning as it was about courage. And yet, despite all this meticulous planning, the revolt was always precarious. Discovery could come at any moment. The masters had eyes and ears, and informers lurked everywhere, ready to betray for safety or reward. Fear was a constant companion, but it was also a motivator, sharpening the focus of those involved. Each conspirator knew that the success of the revolt relied not just on individual bravery, but on the absolute cohesion of the network. One misstep could unravel the entire operation, yet the enslaved continued, driven by a shared vision of vengeance, liberation, and justice. In the end, the organization of the revolt was a testament to the intellect, courage, and resilience of those who were considered powerless by law. It was a dark symphony of secrecy, strategy, and subtlety, unfolding in the shadows of plantation life. The careful orchestration of multiple attacks, the coordination across plantations, and the use of every available resource, both human and environmental, demonstrated a level of sophistication that challenged contemporary assumptions about enslaved people. They were not merely victims of a cruel system. They were planners, strategists, and architects of one of the deadliest revolts in American history. The night was heavy with anticipation. Shadows clung to the corners of the plantation like dark memories, and the usual sounds of nocturnal life. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl, the hum of insects, were punctuated by a tension so thick it seemed almost tangible. Those enslaved who had spent months, even years, preparing for this moment moved silently, each step measured, each breath controlled. The first target was carefully chosen, a master whose cruelty was notorious, whose routine was predictable, and whose family lived in a house that stood isolated among the fields. When the attack began, it was swift and surgical. No cries of rebellion preceded it, no signals to alert the neighbors. The conspirators moved like shadows made flesh, gliding through the darkness with the precision of men and women who had studied every creak in the floorboards, every path of moonlight that might betray them. By the time the household realized what was happening, it was too late. The first master fell in his own bed, the act so sudden and violent that it left the air charged with shock and disbelief. Within hours, the news, or rumor, of the attack began to ripple outward, though in hushed tones, for fear that even speaking it aloud might draw attention from the patrols or informers. Each subsequent assault followed a pattern both terrifying and meticulous. Plantations were struck in rapid succession, the attackers exploiting knowledge of the terrain and the routines of the enslavers. Fields became hunting grounds, homes became traps, and the very land itself seemed complicit in the insurgency. No detail was overlooked. Which doors were locked, which windows were barred, which paths led to safety or to sudden death. The conspirators moved in small, coordinated cells, each responsible for a specific target, ensuring that even if one group was discovered, the others could continue their mission. The violence was precise but not indiscriminate. The conspirators were acutely aware that their goal was not chaos for its own sake, but vengeance and disruption of the oppressive system. Masters were struck down, overseers incapacitated, and those who had benefited most from cruelty were punished with a severity proportional to their crimes. The attacks were brutal but calculated, leaving an unmistakable message. The enslaved would no longer be silent, and the system that had oppressed them for generations was vulnerable. Panic spread among the white population. News of the first killings traveled faster than anyone could verify, and fear gripped communities as rumors inflated the scale of the revolt. Communication remained key even during the attacks. Signals, lights in windows, patterns of fires in the fields, the sound of drums, indicated progress or danger. The conspirators had rehearsed these signs meticulously, and in the chaos of action, these subtle cues kept each cell connected. Escapes were pre-planned. Hidden trails through woods, river crossings, and abandoned structures offered temporary refuge. The land, once a tool of confinement, became an instrument of liberation, guiding the insurgents away from the watchful eyes of patrols and toward the next point of action. One of the most chilling aspects of the revolt was the psychological impact it inflicted. It was not just the loss of life that terrorized the plantation owners. It was the realization that those they had considered property, submissive and powerless, had organized, planned, and executed a campaign of calculated retribution. The fear was almost tangible, like a fog descending over the fields. Masters locked their doors, families barricaded themselves inside, and even the most confident landowners began to doubt every shadow, every whisper, every servant who passed through their halls. The revolt had shifted the balance of power, if only temporarily, and that shift reverberated with a force far greater than the physical acts themselves. As the days unfolded, the attacks continued. 17 masters fell. Over the course of a single month, each act of violence escalating the tension, spreading panic, and forcing the authorities to respond. Militia units were dispatched, patrols intensified, and towns were thrown into a state of near martial law. Yet the insurgents were always one step ahead, their intimate knowledge of the land and routines allowing them to strike and disappear before capture was possible. The revolt became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the enslaved as predators and the masters scrambling to defend their fragile hold on power. The emotional and psychological toll on the insurgents was immense. Even with careful planning, the weight of their actions pressed heavily upon them. They had taken lives, ended routines, and shattered households, yet they did so not out of malice, but from a deep, gnawing need for justice and survival. Each attack required courage bordering on fanaticism to confront the very people who had held absolute control over their lives, to act decisively and with precision, knowing that a single mistake could mean death. Yet their resolve never wavered. The shared purpose, the understanding that they were acting for generations, both past and future, gave them the strength to continue. In parallel, the revolt exposed the fragility of the plantation system. It revealed how much of the perceived power rested not in arms or laws, but in the fear and submission of the enslaved. Once that fear was broken, even briefly, the entire structure became vulnerable. The month-long campaign of attacks demonstrated that the enslaved were not only capable of planning, but of executing operations that rivaled military precision, using the tools, routines, and spaces that had been imposed upon them. Every death, every disrupted household was a lesson in the limits of control, a reminder that oppression breeds resistance, and that silence does not equate to submission. Yet despite the chaos and the death, there was an eerie order to the revolt. It was as if the insurgents were guided by a single, invisible hand, moving with a logic that defied the panic around them. They avoided unnecessary destruction, focused on their targets, and maintained cohesion in a way that surprised even the most experienced militia leaders when they finally attempted to respond. This organization, this disciplined execution, distinguished the 1835 North Carolina revolt from the spontaneous, desperate uprisings that had occurred elsewhere. It was not a fleeting explosion of rage. It was a calculated, sustained assertion of agency and power, executed under conditions designed to suppress any thought of rebellion. By the end of the month, the revolt had left 17 masters dead, a trail of fear in its wake, and a stark message. The enslaved were neither powerless nor invisible. Each attack, each carefully orchestrated act of violence, had carved a dark narrative into the landscape, one that authorities would later seek to erase from memory. But the attacks themselves, and the stories of those who carried them out, became legends among the enslaved, whispered in secrecy as examples of courage, intelligence, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The revolt had reshaped the consciousness of an entire region, leaving an indelible mark on both the oppressed and the oppressors. As the first flames of revolt spread across the plantations, the atmosphere in North Carolina shifted from uneasy stillness to a pervasive, almost tangible dread. News of the killings traveled faster than any official word could contain, carried by whispers, terrified servants, and the faint rumors that slipped through tightly controlled towns. Each story seemed to exaggerate, if only slightly, the scale of the violence, transforming the acts of insurgents into legends of near supernatural wrath. Plantation owners began to look over their shoulders, doors bolted tighter than ever before, and the once complacent local militias scrambled to comprehend the threat that had erupted almost overnight. Fear, however, was only the beginning. Panic was far more infectious, and it spread as quickly as the revolt itself. Masters who had long prided themselves on control over their enslaved populations found themselves paralyzed by the realization that the very people they had considered submissive were capable of extraordinary coordination and deadly intent. Some plantations became fortresses overnight. Shutters nailed closed, fences reinforced, and armed guards posted along every boundary. Families cowered inside, listening to every creak in the night, convinced that death could come from any shadow. The very land, once a tool of dominance, had become a theater of terror. Militias were called in from neighboring counties, but their response was slow and disjointed. Confusion reigned as reports of attacks flooded in, often contradictory and inconsistent. In some towns, militia leaders ordered patrols to scour fields and woods, only to return hours later empty-handed, reporting that no trace of the insurgents could be found. It was as if the revolting enslaved had dissolved into the very soil, leaving only whispers and the faintest disturbances in the undergrowth. Panic deepened as the authorities realized that the attacks were not random acts of desperation but a series of coordinated strikes, each one timed and executed with a level of intelligence that few had anticipated. The escalation was compounded by the psychological weight of uncertainty. Every day brought new reports of violence, yet the full scale of the revolt remained impossible to gauge. Were there dozens of conspirators or hundreds? Which plantations had been targeted next? What was the strategy behind the attacks? This uncertainty fueled fear far more effectively than any visible force could have. Wealthy families, who had long assumed themselves untouchable, began to experience the very vulnerability that their slaves had known for generations. The perceived omnipotence of power, carefully maintained by law and tradition, was crumbling in real time. Amid the chaos, rumors and hysteria amplified the danger. Stories circulated of entire families being wiped out, overseers mutilated, and fields set ablaze, even when these accounts were exaggerated. Every whispered tale added layers of dread, each exaggeration feeding the next. Plantation owners began to question everything and everyone, including their neighbors and even members of their own households. Trust eroded rapidly, and the very social fabric that had upheld the plantation system for decades began to unravel. The fear was not just of death, but of the unknown, the invisible force that seemed to anticipate every move. The enslaved themselves, while executing their revolt with discipline and coordination, also contributed to the escalation through cunning misdirection. Fires were sometimes lit to divert attention, or livestock released to create confusion, while some conspirators feigned submission during the day to lull overseers into complacency. The result was a multi-layered campaign that kept the white population in a constant state of unease. The insurgents understood that fear was a weapon, just as potent as any physical strike, and they wielded it with calculated precision. Local authorities struggled not only with the tactics of the revolt, but also with their own disbelief. Many could not reconcile the apparent intelligence and strategic planning of the enslaved with the narrative they had been told since birth, that the enslaved were docile, incapable of independent thought or coordination. This cognitive dissonance slowed responses and led to miscalculations. Troops were dispatched in the wrong directions, patrols doubled back on themselves, and opportunities to intercept the insurgents were repeatedly missed. The revolt was not merely a physical challenge. It was a psychological puzzle that the plantation owners were ill-prepared to solve. As days turned into weeks, the panic deepened, extending far beyond the immediate plantations. Towns, villages, and even cities felt the reverberations. Merchants and travelers grew wary of roads once considered safe. News of the killings spread along trade routes and into neighboring states, carrying with it a sense of impending doom. The revolt's impact was not limited to the fields. It had become a contagion of fear, destabilizing entire communities. Social norms shifted under the weight of uncertainty. with suspicion and paranoia coloring every interaction. Children were warned to stay indoors, servants scrutinized for hidden motives, and neighbors observed each other with newfound suspicion. Amid the panic, some plantation owners attempted to strike back, but these efforts often revealed the limitations of their understanding. Patrols sent into the woods found themselves confused by false trails, decoys, and the natural knowledge of the insurgents. Ambushes were prepared but foiled by the attackers' intimate understanding of the terrain. Every countermeasure only seemed to reinforce the insurgents' dominance, as though the land itself had joined their cause. The psychological edge of fear continued to grow, becoming a force as powerful as any musket or blade. Even the legal system struggled to keep pace. Courts and magistrates attempted to issue orders, call witnesses, and impose restrictions, but the sheer speed and unpredictability of the attacks rendered many measures ineffective. Reports of attacks were often delayed or censored, adding to confusion and leaving communities feeling vulnerable and exposed. The revolt had exposed a systemic vulnerability that the structures of law, commerce, and social hierarchy were fragile when faced with coordinated, intelligent, and determined resistance. By the end of the month, the escalation and panic had transformed North Carolina's plantations from controlled environments into landscapes of terror. 17 masters had been killed, numerous families traumatized, and the myth of unassailable white authority shattered, if only temporarily. The insurgents had achieved something that extended beyond physical violence. They had rewritten the social dynamics of the region, even as authorities scrambled to restore order. Fear remained, a haunting residue of the revolt, shaping every action, decision, and glance in the weeks that followed. The full extent of the panic was not just local. It spread into collective memory, whispered in town squares and private homes. People debated what might come next, who might rise, and whether the revolt was a singular event or the beginning of something far larger. The uncertainty alone was a weapon, one that kept communities on edge long after the attacks had ceased. In many ways, the fear generated by the revolt became as significant as the deaths themselves, a silent testimony to the insurgents' intelligence, foresight, and psychological acumen. Beneath the surface of the plantations, beneath the apparent order imposed by overseers and masters, there existed a hidden network as intricate as it was invisible. This web of clandestine connections allowed the enslaved to communicate, strategize, and organize with a sophistication that defied the assumptions of those who considered them mere property. It was in these secret channels that the revolt found its lifeblood, and it was here, in the shadows, that the enslaved orchestrated a rebellion capable of toppling lives and spreading fear across an entire region. The networks were built slowly, almost imperceptibly, over years of shared experience and mutual reliance. Trust was both currency and weapon. A single betrayal could destroy months of careful planning and result in immediate death. Because of this, communication had to be subtle, symbolic, and often encoded. Everyday activities became tools for covert messaging. A basket of laundry, hung in a particular pattern, might signal that a meeting was imminent. The timing of a water delivery could indicate a safe window for movement, and even the choice of songs hummed in the fields carried hidden meaning. These were not random gestures, but deliberate acts of intelligence, honed over years to convey critical information without detection. Messages often traveled in fragments, passed along from one individual to another. A child might deliver a seemingly innocent note, unaware of the full meaning contained within, while a domestic servant carried information from one estate to the next under the guise of routine chores. Traders and itinerant workers, moving between towns and plantations, became vital conduits for information, their comings and goings masked as business rather than espionage. Every person who participated in the network, knowingly or unknowingly, became a link in a chain that stretched across the region, connecting conspirators in a lattice of secrecy and shared intent. The network also depended heavily on coded language and symbolism. Common objects, natural features, and routine actions were imbued with double meanings. A rooster crowing at dawn might signify readiness. The arrangement of firewood could indicate danger, and specific patterns in sewing or stitching could serve as directional cues. Even gestures, a slight nod, the adjustment of a hat, a tap on the shoulder, might be a prearranged signal to convey critical instructions. This system allowed conspirators to coordinate attacks across multiple plantations without ever meeting in large groups, minimizing the risk of detection while maintaining operational cohesion. Knowledge of the land itself became another layer of the network. Enslaved individuals memorized hidden trails, streams, and wooded areas, not only for escape but to serve as safe communication routes. Rivers, creeks, and natural landmarks were transformed into pathways of covert movement, allowing messages, supplies, and even small groups of insurgents to move undetected. Trees and rocks were sometimes used as markers, subtle signs only meaningful to those initiated in the network. In effect, the very geography of North Carolina's plantations was co-opted, transformed into a living map of rebellion. This network was not only about communication, it was about community, shared knowledge, and mutual protection. Conspirators relied on each other to maintain secrecy and to support one another in times of risk. If an individual were questioned or threatened, others would intervene subtly, redirect suspicion, or create distractions to ensure safety. This mutual reliance strengthened bonds, created a sense of solidarity, and reinforced the shared purpose that fueled the revolt. Unlike the isolated individuals imagined by the authorities, the enslaved operated as a collective, bound together by necessity and by a vision of justice that had been denied for generations. Some elements of the network were deliberately deceptive, designed to mislead the masters and protect the insurgents' operations. False trails were laid, decoy meetings organized, and misinformation spread to draw attention away from the real plans. Plantation owners, unaware of the layers of subterfuge, often acted on inaccurate reports, sending patrols to empty fields or abandoned cabins, while the conspirators moved unseen, advancing toward their true objectives. This combination of secrecy, intelligence, and deception was a hallmark of the hidden network, elevating the revolt from a simple uprising to a sophisticated campaign of strategic resistance. Religion and spirituality also played a role in maintaining these covert alliances. Hush harbors, secret gatherings in the woods where enslaved people worshipped and shared stories, provided opportunities to convey messages under the guise of prayer and song. Hymns were used as coded communication, with certain verses or melodic patterns indicating safe times to meet, warning of danger, or signaling readiness for action. These spiritual networks not only reinforced solidarity and morale, but also offered practical means of coordination, turning sacred spaces into centers of revolutionary planning. The network extended into the very households of the masters. Domestic servants, cooks, and nurses often had access to information that was inaccessible to field hands or laborers. They could observe routines, overhear conversations, and gather intelligence that would be critical to planning attacks. Some used their positions to subtly manipulate schedules, create opportunities for their fellow conspirators, or provide cover for movement and meetings. The integration of domestic spaces into the network further blurred the line between servitude and strategy, turning the intimate spaces of power into instruments of resistance. Despite its sophistication, the network was incredibly fragile. One slip of the tongue, one misinterpreted signal, could unravel months of preparation. Conspirators constantly adapted, adjusting codes, shifting meeting locations, and altering signals to maintain operational security. This vigilance required not only intelligence but extraordinary discipline and self-control, particularly under the constant threat of discovery. The enslaved who participated in this network were acutely aware that their survival and the success of the revolt depended on their ability to navigate this delicate web with precision. By the time the revolt erupted into violence, the hidden network had already laid the groundwork for success. Its careful construction allowed for coordinated attacks, rapid dissemination of information, and an uncanny ability to evade detection. The insurgents were not acting alone. They were part of a living system, a network that spanned plantations, fields, and forests, connecting individuals through trust, secrecy, and a shared understanding of both the risks and the stakes. The hidden networks also had a profound psychological impact on the masters. While the conspirators moved unseen, the knowledge that they could strike anywhere at any time eroded the sense of absolute control that the white population had long assumed. Panic and paranoia spread, intensified by the very invisibility of the network. Plantation owners could no longer distinguish between routine activity and acts of subversion, and the constant uncertainty amplified the fear generated by the revolt. In this way, the network was as much a weapon of terror as the physical strikes that followed. Ultimately, the hidden networks reveal a truth often overlooked in historical accounts, that the enslaved were not passive victims of oppression, but active, intelligent, and resourceful agents capable of extraordinary coordination. These networks enabled the revolt to take shape, to escalate, and to achieve its deadly impact, all while maintaining secrecy in the face of immense danger. The complexity of the network underscores the insurgents' strategic brilliance, their courage, and their determination to reclaim agency in a world designed to deny them every ounce of power. No act of rebellion, no matter how meticulously planned, can escape the human element entirely. Despite the careful organization, hidden networks, and extraordinary discipline of the insurgents, the revolt in North Carolina was ultimately vulnerable to betrayal. Fear, coercion, and the lure of reward proved powerful forces, capable of unraveling even the most resilient resistance. As the month of attacks drew on, the atmosphere of paranoia intensified, not just among the white population, but within the ranks of the conspirators themselves. Every shadowed pathway, every hushed conversation, carried the possibility of discovery. The first cracks appeared subtly. Whispers of dissent and mistrust began to circulate among the enslaved. Some feared the consequences of being caught. Others were coerced into revealing fragments of the plan under the threat of immediate punishment or death. A single misstep, a hesitant gesture, a poorly timed comment, a misplaced letter, was enough to expose connections that had been nurtured in secrecy for years. What had been a tightly woven network became frayed at the edges, and the conspirators found themselves facing not only the external threat of armed militia, but the internal danger of betrayal. Local authorities and plantation owners, desperate to quell the uprising, exploited these vulnerabilities with calculated precision. They offered rewards, pardons, and promises of leniency to anyone willing to disclose information about the revolt. In some cases, enslaved individuals were tortured to extract details, forced to name co-conspirators, reveal meeting places, and explain the coded signals that had enabled such remarkable coordination. The fear of discovery, combined with the relentless pressure of violence and intimidation, gradually eroded the secrecy that had been the revolt's greatest strength. The betrayals were both deliberate and accidental. Some enslaved individuals, driven by self-preservation or the hope of reward, disclosed critical information to authorities. Others, who may not have fully understood the extent of the revolt, inadvertently revealed details in casual conversation, trusting a fellow worker, or overestimating the loyalty of neighbors. Each disclosure was like a fissure in a dam, allowing the full force of the suppression to flood in. The insurgents who had evaded detection for weeks suddenly found themselves vulnerable, with patrols and militias converging on known safe houses, secret pathways, and hidden gathering spots. Militia forces, once slow and uncertain, became methodical in their pursuit. They moved with a cold efficiency, guided by the intelligence gained from betrayal and coercion. Homes were searched, fields combed, and rivers monitored. Every tree line, barn, and shed became a potential hiding place under scrutiny. The insurgents, trained in stealth and deception, now faced opponents armed with both knowledge and desperation. The advantage they had held in secrecy was slipping, and the reality of suppression loomed with a growing inevitability. The psychological toll of betrayal was profound. Among the insurgents, fear mutated into suspicion. Even those who had never wavered in loyalty began to question the intentions of their companions. Whispers of treachery, the shifting glances of supposed allies, and the sudden disappearance of familiar faces created an environment of tension and paranoia. Coordination became harder, meetings were delayed or canceled, and the network that had allowed such precise attacks began to unravel under the pressure. The revolt, once a symbol of collective power, was now threatened from within as well as without. Punishment, when captured, was swift and brutal. Those apprehended faced the full force of the law, often enacted with horrifying spectacle to deter others. Public executions, floggings, and mutilations were common, each act designed to instill fear and reinforce the dominance of the masters. Families of insurgents were not spared. Wives, children, and siblings were sometimes punished, imprisoned, or sold to distant plantations as retribution. The revolt had exposed not just a physical vulnerability, but a moral one, revealing the lengths to which the system would go to maintain control and suppress dissent. Yet, even as the network was betrayed and suppressed, traces of its sophistication and daring remained. Authorities often expressed astonishment at the intelligence demonstrated by the insurgents, the way attacks were coordinated, the use of coded signals, and the ability to evade capture for weeks. Reports described ambushes foiled at the last minute, escape routes anticipated and exploited, and communication that had reached across multiple plantations. This acknowledgement, grudging as it was, confirmed what the enslaved had known all along. They had not been powerless. They had acted with strategy and purpose, and their efforts had shaken the foundations of the plantation system. The suppression also highlighted the social fragility that the revolt had exposed. White communities, which had relied on fear and subjugation to maintain control, were forced into defensive postures, deploying militias and reinforcing laws to prevent any recurrence. Laws were tightened, patrols increased, and surveillance intensified. The revolt became a lesson in the dangers of underestimating the intelligence and agency of the enslaved, prompting systemic changes designed to maintain dominance. The consequences of rebellion extended beyond the immediate violence. They reshaped social, legal, and economic structures in an attempt to prevent future insurrections. Even after the revolt was crushed, the memory of betrayal lingered. Among the surviving insurgents, fear of discovery persisted, as did grief for those who had been captured or executed. Trust, once essential to the hidden networks, became a precious and fragile commodity. Families were broken apart, communities disrupted, and a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion replaced the solidarity that had fueled the rebellion. The betrayal of even a few individuals had been sufficient to dismantle what had been an extraordinary operation, proving that the most formidable threats to the system were those that could not be contained by force alone. At the same time, the revolt suppression became a cautionary tale for both enslaved and free populations. Stories circulated, some exaggerated, others grimly factual, about the consequences of defiance, the punishments inflicted, and the betrayals that had led to capture. These narratives served a dual purpose. They were tools of intimidation for the enslaved and a way for authorities to assert moral and physical dominance over a population they feared but had failed to fully control. The lesson was clear. Rebellion was possible, but the costs were devastating, and even the most carefully organized resistance could be undone by fear, coercion, or betrayal. In the end, the suppression of the revolt in North Carolina illustrates a paradox. The insurgents displayed remarkable intelligence, courage, and coordination, yet their success was always contingent upon human loyalty and secrecy, two elements inherently fragile under extreme pressure. Betrayal, whether voluntary or forced, proved sufficient to dismantle the network and restore the appearance of control. Yet the revolt also left an indelible mark on history, revealing the capacities of those who had been denied agency and highlighting the vulnerabilities of a system built on oppression and fear. The revolt of 1835 in North Carolina did not end with the last execution or the final arrest. Its legacy stretched far beyond the immediate devastation and terror, embedding itself into the psyche of both enslaved and free communities, and leaving scars that would shape generations. For the enslaved, the revolt was a stark reminder of what could be achieved even under the most oppressive circumstances, and yet simultaneously of the fragility of their resistance. The lessons learned were brutal. Courage could inspire and organize, but betrayal, coercion, and overwhelming force could extinguish even the most meticulously planned rebellion. Among enslaved populations, the memory of the revolt was preserved, in whispers, in coded songs, and in the quiet retelling of events when the eyes of overseers were elsewhere. Stories of bravery, intelligence, and sacrifice became legends, passed down through generations, shaping the consciousness of those who remained bound by chains. The revolt demonstrated that resistance was possible and that the enslaved were not merely passive recipients of oppression but active agents capable of challenging an entrenched system. Yet, the knowledge of betrayal and the swift, merciless suppression served as a cautionary undertone. Freedom could be glimpsed, but the cost of claiming it outright was lethal. For the white population, the revolt left an equally profound, though very different, impression. Fear lingered long after the attacks ended. Plantation owners, neighbors, and local authorities had glimpsed the vulnerability of a system they had long assumed unassailable. The killings of 17 masters within a single month shattered the illusion of total control, leaving a psychological wound that could not be erased. Even as the militias reasserted dominance, the fear of rebellion persisted, reshaping daily routines, increasing surveillance, and prompting harsher enforcement of laws governing the enslaved. Social relations were permanently altered, paranoia became institutionalized, and trust eroded in ways that would shape the social fabric for decades. The revolt also exposed the fragility and hypocrisy of the American legal and social system. The very laws and norms that claimed to maintain order and justice were revealed to rely fundamentally on fear, coercion, and the suppression of basic human rights. The insurgents' ability to organize, communicate, and execute deadly attacks under such conditions was a damning indictment of the supposed rationality and stability of the plantation system. Historians and observers would later note that revolts like this were not random acts of violence but deliberate assertions of agency, demanding recognition of humanity denied by law and custom. In the decades following the revolt, the lessons learned influenced both the enslaved and those in power. Among enslaved populations, the memory of strategic organization, hidden networks, and coordinated attacks informed future acts of resistance. Even in small acts of defiance, in subtle subversions of authority, the ethos of the 1835 revolt lingered, a reminder that intelligence, courage, and unity could challenge the impossible. Among the white population, the revolt justified increased militarization, more rigid policing of the enslaved, and an expansion of surveillance mechanisms, reflecting a deep-seated fear that such rebellion could recur. The revolt became a historical touchstone for both sides of the equation, a moment of crisis that shaped responses and behavior long after the events themselves had faded from public memory. The revolt also illuminated the role of secrecy and networks in resisting oppression. The methods employed by the insurgents, coded language, clandestine meetings, hidden trails, and decentralized leadership, became a blueprint for understanding how oppressed populations could assert agency under extreme conditions. These networks were not just tactical tools, they were embodiments of trust, solidarity, and resilience. The very sophistication of these methods challenged contemporary assumptions about the capabilities of the enslaved and provided a profound lesson in human ingenuity under constraint. Culturally, the revolt had a more subtle but equally lasting effect. Stories of the uprising filtered into folklore, song, and oral tradition, embedding a narrative of resistance and cunning into the collective memory of the region. The revolt became more than a historical event. It became a symbol of defiance, a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who had been enslaved. Even as written records attempted to erase, minimize, or distort the truth, the revolt persisted in memory, ensuring that its lessons endured across generations. These cultural echoes reinforce the idea that history is not only recorded in books, but lived in the minds, memories, and stories of those who survive oppression. The revolt also forces a reckoning with the nature of justice and morality in societies built on slavery. The insurgents acted under extreme duress, driven by the desire for freedom, survival, and retribution against unimaginable cruelty. From a moral perspective, the revolt challenges the conventional framing of crime and punishment, highlighting the inherent injustice of a system that criminalized resistance while protecting the interests of oppressors. This dark lesson, the blurred line between justice and revenge under oppression, continues to resonate in historical analysis, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about the legacies of power, violence, and systemic inequality. In a broader, historical sense, the 1835 revolt stands as one of the bloodiest and most meticulously organized slave uprisings in American history. Its scale, intensity, and impact underscore the persistent tension between oppression and resistance, revealing that even in the most controlled and surveilled environments, human beings will seek freedom. The Revolt's legacy reminds us that systems built on fear and subjugation are never truly stable. They rely on the suppression of information, the manipulation of belief, and the enforcement of obedience. When those systems are challenged, even temporarily, the resulting disruption can be both immediate and far-reaching. Finally, the Revolt's story carries a lesson about memory and history itself. While official records may attempt to minimize the revolt, portraying it as isolated or the product of irrational rage, the truth is far more complex. The insurgents demonstrated planning, intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking that demand recognition. The legacy of the revolt challenges historians, educators, and society to confront the realities of oppression and resistance, to acknowledge the voices of those who fought back, and to understand that history is shaped as much by hidden networks, moral courage, and daring defiance as by those who hold power on paper. Even today, the echoes of 1835 linger, a dark testament to the cost of resistance and the enduring human desire for agency and justice. It serves as a reminder that oppression, no matter how absolute it seems, is always vulnerable to intelligence, solidarity, and courage. And it forces us to confront the uncomfortable question that history often buries. How many acts of resistance, carefully organized and brutally suppressed, have been erased from memory, leaving only fragments of fear, rumor, and legend behind? The revolt's legacy is thus twofold: a tribute to the audacity of the enslaved and a warning about the lengths to which oppressive systems will go to maintain control. If the story you just witnessed left chills running down your spine, know that this is only one fragment of history's hidden shadows. Throughout time, secrets have been buried, truths silenced, and rebellions erased from memory. But the echoes remain, waiting for those willing to look closer. Imagine what else is hidden in the crevices of history, the stories too dark, too forbidden, or too dangerous to be told aloud. Every episode we explore uncovers layers of mystery, betrayal, and courage that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. If you want to continue this journey into the forgotten, forbidden, and fearsome corners of history, hit that subscribe button now. By subscribing, you'll ensure you never miss another story that pushes the boundaries of what we think we know about our world, our ancestors, and the forces that shaped them. We want to hear from you too. Which part of this story disturbed you the most? Which hidden truths do you think remain buried to this day? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could spark a discussion that uncovers even more dark, forgotten history. Every like, comment, and subscription supports our mission to reveal the histories they never wanted you to know. So don't stay in the dark. Join us, explore the secrets, and confront the truths history tried to hide. Subscribe, comment, and step into the shadows with us.